Sometimes the greatest stories aren't about achieving a goal, but about what happens when everything goes catastrophically wrong. In April 1970, what was supposed to be America's third moon landing became maybe the most incredible survival story ever told. It's an amazing testament to human ingenuity against the absolute emptiness of space. This is the story of Apollo 13. It all started with these 7 words. Just think about that. Spoken so calmly from 200,000 miles away from home. This single sentence kicked off a life-or-death crisis. A mission of exploration instantly became a desperate, nail-biting race to bring 3 men back to Earth alive. You have to understand, this mission was supposed to be almost routine. NASA had already landed on the moon twice. They were confident. So astronauts Jim Lovell, Jack Swigert, and Fred Hayes were on their way up, and while the world was watching, that initial excitement felt a little, familiar by then. And for the first 2 days, everything went off without a hitch. The launch? Flawless. For 46 straight hours, the spacecraft did exactly what it was supposed to do, kind of lulling the crew and mission control into this false sense of security. They were just coasting, 250,000 miles from home, with absolutely no reason to think this trip would be anything but another victory lap. And then it happened. 2 days into the flight, the universe decided to remind everybody just how fragile we really are out there. A standard, everyday procedure would suddenly and violently rip the mission to shreds, turning their chariot to the moon into a crippled, dying vessel. The whole thing started with a simple, boring task. Mission Control asked Jack Swigert to stir the cryogenic oxygen tanks, just to get a more accurate reading. Totally standard procedure. But this time, when he flipped that switch, the entire spacecraft shuddered with a massive, catastrophic bang. The damage was immediate and devastating. It wasn't just a failure. Oxygen tank number 2 literally exploded. It blew a hole in the side of the service module and wrecked tank number 1 in the process. So in an instant, their power, their light, and worst of all, their air started bleeding out into the vacuum of space. With their command ship, the Odyssey, effectively dead, the crew had only one play left. They had to shut it down completely and scramble into the lunar module, the Aquarius. Now, this tiny craft was designed to land 2 guys on the moon for about a day. Now it had to become a makeshift lifeboat for 3 men on a 4-day nightmare journey home. Meanwhile, back in Houston, while the astronauts were fighting for every breath, Flight Director Gene Kranz just laid down the law. He looked at all this impossible, terrible data scrolling across the screens and made a declaration that became the mission's guiding star. Failure, he said, was simply not an option. The conditions inside that tiny lifeboat were brutal. Absolutely brutal. With all the main power off, the temperature plunged to just above freezing. Condensation formed on every single surface, just dripping down the walls constantly. The astronauts were getting severely dehydrated, rationing water to just a few sips a day. And sleep? In that bone-chilling cold? Forget about it. But the cold was only one of their problems. A much more immediate threat was building up all around them. The air itself. See, with 3 guys crammed into a space built for 2, the carbon dioxide they were breathing out was quickly reaching toxic levels. They were quite literally poisoning their own atmosphere. And this, right here, led to one of the most famous engineering challenges in history. The main spacecraft had plenty of spare CO2 filters, but they were at the wrong shape for the lunar module system. They wouldn't fit. So the question for the engineers on the ground was, how in the world do you solve this impossible puzzle using only the random stuff the crew has on board with them? The problem was pretty stark. As you can see, the spare cartridges from the command module, they were square. But the openings in the lunar module's filtration system, they were round. It was the classic square peg in a round hole problem, but with the lives of 3 men hanging in the balance. And there was no procedure for this in the manual. They had to invent one, right then and there. The solution was pure, unadulterated genius. Back in Houston, engineers dumped a box of every item they knew was on the spacecraft onto a table. Plastic bags, cardboard from a manual cover, a sock, and of course, duct tape. They figured out how to build a working adapter right there on the spot and then read the instructions step by step to the crew 200,000 miles away. And unbelievably, it worked. Okay, so they could breathe again, and they were surviving the cold, but they were a long, long way from being out of the woods. Some of the most dangerous parts of the journey were still ahead of them. They now had to get their crippled ship pointed in exactly the right direction to even have a prayer of hitting Earth's atmosphere. This is where it gets really incredible. With most of the electronics powered down to save every last bit of energy, the ship's advanced navigation computers were totally useless. Commander Jim Lovell had to manually fire the lunar module's engine to correct their course. And as you can see here, he did it using nothing but the crescent Earth in his window as a guide. One mistake, one tiny miscalculation, and they'd either bounce off the atmosphere and be lost in space forever, or just burn up on re-entry.
And that brings us to the final, terrifying unknown. The explosion had been violent, and nobody, not on Earth, not in that tiny spacecraft, knew if the command module's heat shield had been cracked or compromised. That shield was the one thing that would protect them from the fiery heat of re-entry, and there was absolutely no way to check. They just had to hope it held.
As the capsule slammed into the atmosphere, the intense heat created a plasma sheath around it, which cut off all radio communication. For 4.5 agonizing minutes, mission control and the entire world could only listen to static. The silence was just deafening. Were they alive, or had the heat shield failed? And then, a voice crackled through the static. They had made it. They had survived re-entry. The mission to land on the moon was, yes, a failure, but the mission to bring the crew home, it was an astonishing, almost unbelievable success. This was the moment, the sight the entire world had been holding its breath for. 3 main parachutes, blooming perfectly against the blue Pacific sky. The capsule splashed down safely. 3 men, against all possible odds, were home. Flight director Gene Kranz later called it NASA's finest hour. And not because they got to where they were going, but because when everything imaginable went wrong, when the technology failed and disaster struck, it was human ingenuity, teamwork, and a sheer refusal to give up that triumphed over the impossible. And really, that's the ultimate lesson of Apollo 13. It's this powerful reminder that true success isn't always about achieving your original goal. Sometimes it's about the courage and the resourcefulness you discover when you're facing down an impossible challenge. What does it really mean to succeed against all odds? Apollo 13 gave us the answer.